Great. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be able to be here and take part in this series, and always a pleasure to visit the Simons Institute. Speaking as someone who's not situated here at Berkeley, but seeing it from the outside, it's really become in a very short amount of time this amazing and much treasured resource for, I think, for the CS theory community and also just for the field of computing more broadly. It's really been sort of instrumental in bringing together groups of researchers and really helping to advance the field. And it's great to be able to take part in this event with them. So what I want to talk about today was some of the ways in which basic mathematical models in computer science are really merging with some of the massive data sets that we're getting from the internet to help us understand some of what's happening both in the online world, how information is being shared, how people are connecting in the online world, and also maybe what that tells us a bit about what's happening in the offline world as well, in our everyday lives and in society. And part of the activity here really is going to be to take phenomena that hopefully are familiar from our everyday experience, that we either experience on the internet or we experience in our everyday lives, and to try sort of turning them over and looking for some of the computational underpinnings, the mathematical underpinnings of them, and to really ask, what can we do here? This data, in some sense, makes possible certain things that really weren't possible, right? It's in a sense a revolution in measurement that lets us see things in new ways, and computation is really crucial for that activity. I'm going to start with the internet and the web, and that's going to be in part what motivates a lot of this. And what's interesting about our conception of the web, which is now approaching, depending how you count, maybe its 25th anniversary, is that as time has gone on, our metaphors for what the web is, what the internet is, have evolved, and in some significant ways. Right? So when I was sort of leaving grad school, if you had asked me and my friends, what is the web? What do you think of when we say the web? We would have thought of sort of the picture on the left, right? This sort of universal library of all human knowledge. You would sort of dip into it and pull out these sort of nuggets of information, right? All of humanity was putting their knowledge online. And so the basic units that we thought in were, these pages that, like sort of books in a library. They're linked together by their associations. Now, 10 years after that point, in this sort of really transformative 2004 to 2006 period, things changed and sort of dramatically in that window, right? We have to remember that was really a 3-year period when you saw, all at once the emergence of Facebook, of YouTube, of Twitter, right? A lot of things all happening at once. In effect, it was almost like the people had stepped out from behind their web pages and were beginning to interact more directly. And so we ended up having the second metaphor that began to kind of mingle with the first one, this metaphor of the crowd, right? This collection of people who react in real time to events as they happen, and that to really understand an event online or even offline was to really try assembling these fragmentary points of view from millions of people all reacting in real time to the same thing, right? And that was really what it was to experience the internet. And so what I think is interesting is that going forward, the internet has really preserved this tension between the library and the crowd, right? It's both this giant repository of knowledge, but it's also all the people who mingle among it, add to it, comment on it, interact with each other. Now, you might not be surprised to hear, although it's interesting to notice, that this notion of the library versus the crowd didn't begin with the internet. This tension between how to think about information was present in in a number of ideas sort of throughout the 20th century, and some of the deepest writing about information that we saw over the last century. So the metaphor of the library, right, the internet as library, where does that go back to? It certainly predates the internet. Some would argue it came from this sort of strangely prescient article that Vannevar Bush wrote in the Atlantic Monthly in 1945 called As We May Think. And the message was that, World War II has just come to an end. It's time to take all of the activity, all of the sort of horrendous activity that's been happening and turn it to more peaceful uses and to really build up science both nationally and in the world. And he looked out and said, what's interesting, and this was really sort of a remarkable thing to say in 1945, the problem is not a lack of creativity or a lack of imagination. The problem, in a sense, is going to be keeping up with everything that everybody knows so that we can actually all build on what each other are doing. And so he asked himself, how are we going to use technology to help address the problem that there's just too much for any one human being to really know? And so he began to sort of speculate. And it's interesting to read the article if you haven't. he really imagines something, again, 1945, that really looks a lot like the web, right? He talks about how wholly new forms of encyclopedias will appear, ready-made with a mesh of associative trails running through them. He really talked about hyperlinking quite explicitly. And he even sort of imagines sort of, the rise of the search industry, that there'll be a whole new profession of trailblazers who will actually sort of establish useful trails through all of these hyperlinks. Now, it's maybe not entirely coincidental that he had this vision and it came true to a remarkable extent, in that, Vannevar Bush was not just an arbitrary person writing in The Atlantic. He was also had a lot of influence in the science funding establishment of the United States at the time, and really, I think, directed a lot of basic research into things that now have paid off enormously, a story that we've seen recounted many times. That was the library. Now, the story of the crowd was there from the beginning also. And here's sort of a canonical thing that encapsulates that, and this is by Elihu Katz and Paul Lazarsfeld. Elihu Katz, I actually had the good fortune to meet at a conference in about 10 years ago, actually 12 years ago now, just before the 2004 presidential election. He was very late in his career at that point. And he and I had a good time talking about how, each in our own way, we were interested in the effects of disruptive technological change on the political process. In my case, I was thinking about the internet and blogging and what it was doing in the 2004 election. He had thought about radio and TV and how they affected the political process in the 1940s and 1950s. And again, you might have thought that radio and the TV was about broadcasting knowledge and information to everybody around the country. And it was sort of doing that. But what they found was that actually when they went and did extensive interviews in this work they did, that radio on the printed page seemed to have only negligible effects on the actual vote decision. When people asked, what had contributed to their decision, their answer was other people. Right? And so thus was born the idea of the two-step flow of information, that information comes to some people, but then it sort of moves through the social network of the world from person to person by word of mouth, and that's a lot about how opinion is formed, right? That the crowd is really central to this. So there are really these two ideas going on. And part of what I'm hoping to do here is to kind of delve into that tension and talk about some of the ways in which the kind of data that we've been gathering on the internet and the kind of models we've been building over the last 10 years let us think about how the crowd operates, how does this information actually spread through populations by word of mouth, what causes it to be transported, what causes it to succeed or fail, how do our social networks affect that. Okay, so if we want to do that, we should talk about the basic substrate on which all of this is operating, right? Who are these other people, and how is it that they come into your life and affect what you think? And for that, we want to use the language of social networks. And one nice thing with using social networks as a model is it's sort of not hard to start from first principles with social networks and just draw them and talk about what I have in mind here. So social networks start with you at the center. And you're connected to some people, right? So perhaps you're a student and you have classmates. And so all of my pictures here are going to be of these things I call graphs or networks, in which each person is a little circle here, a node, and these line segments are the friendship connections, right? So you're friends with your two classmates. Note that they're also friends with each other. And of course, your little position in the social network is not, just like that. Maybe you also have a job. You have these coworkers. You know them. They know each other. Note that your two coworkers don't know your two classmates. You see your classmates during the day, and then maybe in the evening you go to this job you have, and you see your coworkers. No reason to believe they should know each other. Somewhere, not even geographically in the same place, there's some family members, and they know each other. And you know them. And then, of course, there are just acquaintances you have, people who don't seem otherwise plugged into the rest of your social life. Now, we're going to sort of repeatedly come back to this kind of picture. And I'll note that not all links here are created equal. And one of the fundamental things that sociologists talk about, actually, and it's sort of crucial to our understanding of social networks, such as this one, right, this pattern of friendships among people, is this distinction between strong ties and weak ties. Strong ties, namely close friendships, things where you feel this real affective bond to people. And so for example, maybe you have strong ties to your family members, maybe to your classmates you have strong ties. And then weak ties to people that you don't know very well, acquaintances, people you've met only a few times, maybe like this acquaintance here. And there are certain characteristic patterns to these, right? Your strong ties tend to be clustered into groups who know each other. And your weak ties tend to be sort of off in space, and you may not have any friends in common with them because the two of you inhabit different social circles. And the point is, strong ties and weak ties do different things, right? Strong ties are very good for promoting trusted interactions where you can have some confidence in the integrity of what's happening across the link. You sort of know how this person will behave, you trust them. Weak ties have their own value, right? As Mark Granovetter famously chronicled in the 1970s, weak ties can be the sources of new information that come into your life, right? If you're going to learn something truly new, it often comes via a weak tie because those people know things that you don't. They travel in different social circles. Okay, so, and the interesting thing is that this is my cartoon picture. But if you actually pull up data, say from Facebook, where people document, here are my friends, and the friends document who they're friends with, it's remarkable how much it actually sort of looks like this. So here's an actual social network neighborhood. This is a Facebook engineer at the center who, for this purpose, donated their network to science so we can look at here. And these are all people who are friends with this person, right? So these are all their friends. So they're at the center, and it's exactly like the cartoon. There's a link out to each of them. And then there are the links among them. And it's sort of impressive how much just from this picture you can learn about, things about this person's life, right? It sort of gives us pause when we imagine this. So these people all know each other. This is clearly one part of this person's life. This is some very different part of this person's life. I've kind of arranged it like in my cartoon. These actually are his coworkers at Facebook. These are his old friends from college. They graduated. Somewhere in here are family members. Other things might be sort of hobbies he has, people he knows through those. Right? Each of these is some little cluster of his life. And it makes sense that this thing is so highly clusterable because the only reason I've drawn a bunch of Facebook employees, a bunch of college alums, some family members, the only reason I've drawn all these people on the same screen is because of him. Right? He is the thing that pulls these together, as each of us is really the thing that pulls all these different parts of our life together. Okay, so, and if you page through hundreds of these things, from Facebook data, you'll see that they all kind of look like this. Yours looks like this, and mine looks like this. We all have these different parts of our life densely connected within themselves, well separated, and then with these sort of, acquaintance links, right? And keep in mind, this person has an equally rich network. We just don't see it because they have no other friends in common with this person. Okay, so this was some, I'll come back to this, but as colleagues of mine, in particular, two of my former students, Lars Backstrom, who's now at Facebook, and Johan Ugander, who's now at Stanford, as we worked on some of this data, we would keep coming back to these pictures, and we found them, I guess, aesthetically compelling in a way. And like any aesthetically compelling thing, every time you come back to it and look at it, even a year later, after looking at it, you see things you hadn't seen before, right? It's a rich kind of picture. All right, we'll come back to that. So I wanted to sort of walk through what's actually going on in these networks, right? So the idea was the crowd, which conveys information and opinions to you. This is how information flows on the internet. To think about social networks as transport mechanisms for all sorts of things, information and opinions, new behaviors, new social practices, new cultural practices. And I want to talk about it in three parts. First, a bit about sort of how to think about, in this sort of network context, the structure of how information actually spreads through the system. And some questions about how would you reconstruct the spread of something if you encountered it out in the wild. Secondly, we'll start with just information spreading as a kind of atomic object, not think about what the information is. But of course, if we think about things that we share online, things we encounter online, the content of the message matters, right? Some things are simply more viral than some other things. And so I'll ask a bit about how does message content affect this. And then finally, I'll come back to this point about strong and weak ties, because if we want to really understand how the information gets to you, it's coming at you differently through different parts of your network. It becomes important to understand more about the rich structure of that network to understand how it works. And through all of this, I'll sort of try to highlight some of the models that we're building. In a sense, the decision to treat things as a graph is already a first modeling choice, right? It seems to us kind of uncontroversial, but we can talk afterwards about how many different things we could have done there. We'll see graphs actually throughout. I'll try to sort of call attention to them, but they're a very good way of representing what takes place in this. Okay, so how information spreads. So this idea of sort of viral information propagation is sort of almost as old as the first widespread public adoption of the internet, right? It predates social media, it predates web search. It comes back to things that people emailed around to each other. This is maybe the oldest instance of something to go truly viral. This was kind of in the 1993, 94 phase, right? So relatively few people, sort of were on the web at that point. The web was relatively new. A lot of people had some kind of email address at the time. And so this was someone, actually this was Elizabeth Weinert, who was a student at the University of Northern Colorado. And she had sort of heard on the radio that NPR, funding national public radio, was threatened. And she thought we should do something about this. And here's a tool, the internet, with which we could mobilize a lot of people. maybe what we should do is write a petition, using the internet, send it to, a bunch of people, maybe the President of the United States, the Vice President, and so forth, send it all to them, and, just show how much support there is for National Public Radio. And there was an appeal. And so this had the structure of many internet petitions that have gone around, that have now migrated from email to Facebook, for example. And many of you might recognize the structure of this thing from things you've encountered on Facebook. There's sort of an appeal at the beginning, right? Some kind of really pithy sentence about, isn't this really worth $1.12 per year for you? And then some instructions, right? The instructions here are, please add your name to the list, forward it to friends, and then, this list will be forwarded to all these important people who will then go and save National Public Radio. And if you're one of these, sort of a multiple of 50 in your signatures, please forward a copy back to me. This was her address, or at least it was her address until about 3 days after she sent the petition out onto the internet. This somehow triggered, it hit some tipping point and was much more successful than anything that had been tried like this before. So successful that the reverse wave of emails coming back to her not only brought down her inbox, but actually brought down the entire University of Northern Colorado system, which, again, in 1994, had, the equivalent of what we would now consider kind of a home dial-up connection to the internet, as many universities did. And so it simply could not deal with the flood of emails coming back in. So they had to kind of take themselves offline, fix everything, and so forth. These, of course, became increasingly common. Possibly the biggest one of all time in the pre-social media era was one that sort of convulsively circled the world in fall of 2002, spring of 2003, right before the US invasion of Iraq. Very similar structure, right? There's a opening little appeal, and then there's some instructions, similar instructions. They sort of wised up in the meantime. They decided to run the denial service attack on somebody else. So please send a copy message to these addresses, definitely not back to them. And again, it circled around the world and actually became the subject of news in and of itself, right? The fact there was this much mobilization going on the internet. And so this was 2000, 2003, right? So it's sort of, one forgets how little there was. There was no Gmail, right? I mean, forget Facebook, right? There weren't even really big centralized repositories of email. So whatever was happening here, no one entity or organization could even see what was happening, right? Because it was jumping between different email providers, different servers, and so forth. And so it occurred to a student who I was working with at the time and have had a very rewarding collaboration up until the present, David Libben-Nowell. He and I thought, and he really had this insight, this is really a tracer for something that in 2003 we could not see by other means. You see these things circling the world, but even if you worked with Google, Microsoft, whatever, you would not be able to see actually the structure by which it spread. Is there some way that we could actually trace out how this worked? Right? And the insight was that a chain letter petition has two nice properties, right, that you sort of need in conjunction. One is it's a chain letter, so it spreads virally, like is what we want to study, right? How is this thing spreading virally to the network? But secondly, it's a petition, so everyone signs it in order. And so if you get your hands on a copy of it, you see the path it took all the way back to the original person. Okay, so that was the idea. Two things, right? It's a tracer for a chain letter because it has the petition element. Now, if you get your hands on one of them, maybe that's hard to figure out what happened. All these people really sign their names. Did someone else write these names? If you get many copies, maybe we can start to do some detective work. Okay. It was also interesting to us to kind of think back to this idea of like people browsing through information, right? Think about this whole new profession of trailblazers who are going to blaze trails through the documents. And think how perfectly the chain letter is really an exact dual to the act of browsing on the internet, right? Rather than a person blazing a trail through the network of documents, it really is the document blazing the trails through the network of people. Now, obviously, it's the people who still have the agency. They're the ones choosing to forward it. But it's really not the person who lights up the mesh of associative trails among the documents. It's really the document that has lit up the mesh of social trails through the people. OK, now, just because we're going to sort of want this picture in our minds, here's a second graph, not of who's friends with whom, but of who sent the email to whom, right? So some first person decided to create this petition and sign it, right? And the reason these things get so big, and we sort of intuitively understand this, is that if they send it to 3 people, and they send it to 3 people, and they send it to 3 people, the thing really fans out very, very quickly, right? And that's the kind of structure that we're hoping to reconstruct. Now, the problem, of course, is that full structure is unobservable. And as I said, in 2002, 2003, it was unobservable to everybody, right? There was no organization that had its hands on this object. And that's still true of many cases where the internet is being used to mobilize, right? When it's being done entirely within one social media site, then maybe that organization sees the entire thing. But very often and generally, the thing is actually leaping between different platforms. And so one wants some kind of forensic method of actually seeing. So what was the idea? And this was David's great insight, which has continued to be useful for these kinds of reconstructions now, that we don't have this tree. But we do have hundreds of copies of this thing that were posted publicly on the internet. And every time a copy is publicly posted, we see the person who posted it and their path all the way back, right? And that's a little trail through this tree. So, oh, that's the laser pointer, there we go. Right, so maybe these people, these 5 people posted their copy. Now, what happens when you post a copy? You see all the names that go back, right? And so you see that these 2, for example, meet back at Bob, and these 2 people, these 2 meet back at Dan, and this one actually remains distinct all the way back to the root, right? And so the part we see is just that part. Right? So you see how that works? It was sort of hidden in the whole tree, but this is, every time someone posts, I post this to something on the internet, with the names, I light up that path all the way back to the start of the tree. Now, notice that this means we don't get the tree, and in fact, we get something which is biased in some very specific ways. It's a very stringy tree, because we have these many stringy paths, and we don't see all the branching that has happened. So we're going to need to do some kind of estimation of what's going on afterwards. But that was the plan. OK, so now we have this reconstruction task. We go out to the internet, and we find lists of names of people who signed the petition, right? So here's a copy of the petition, and at the bottom are these 8 names of people who have signed it, right? And so, OK, we're trying to reconstruct our tree. Not hard. So we're going to, on this side, we have the copies of the petition. And on this side, we have yet another graph that we're building. This is, again, the graph of who sent to whom. Right? So we start with A, and they just sent it straight down this line. OK. And this is kind of a fun activity you can even do with sort of scissors and Scotch tape if you wanted, although computer is easier. So here, they agree up to F. And then this one went to I and J, but that one went to G and H. So we see that F actually appears to have sent it to 2 people, and it continued on its way. And this one branched even higher up. It appears that D sent it on to these people. OK, now, nothing is ever this easy, right? No information on the internet is ever as beautifully clean as this cartoon suggests. So you immediately start encountering a big mess once you start doing this. There are all sorts of corruptions in the data. So for example, people would often go up and sort of change one of the names high up, right? They would do this because they wanted to stick someone else's name on it. This being the internet, people would sort of stick the name George Bush up there or Condoleezza Rice. They would do all sorts of things. And so you get these bulges, lots of bulges in the thing, right? People would also get it, and they would decide the thing looked too long. So they decide, all these names is distracting. Let me just cut those out. And so in our reconstruction, it looks like it jumps straight from here to there. It doesn't really. So we found ourselves actually with a more complicated graph. And if you did manual inspection, these things were clearly appeared to be corruptions. Of course, all of these are estimations. We weren't there. We didn't see what the person actually did to the email before they sent it out. But these things tended to be rare, whereas the other ones tended to be reinforced by many, many independent copies on the internet. And so, in effect, we had to go and look for an algorithm to clean up this data. And we really had on our hands sort of almost a kind of biological mutations in some sense, right? So every kind of, if you think about sort of the mutations that can happen to a chromosome, every single one that was represented here, right? You had point mutations, you had block deletions, you even had actually duplications, you had all sorts of things, right? We had one recombination where someone had taken 2 of them and carefully interleaved them. And so you had to do all sorts of things to sort of clean up this data. And we really had this sort of ready supply of kind of, these kind of data cleaning algorithms. And a lot of them came from sort of bioinformatics applications where you were trying to clean up a bunch of mutated gene sequences. One simple one, just to kind of explain, would be that we look at how much support there is for each of these links. In my cartoon example, the numbers don't get that big. But you see, these ones are rare, these ones are frequent. You could say, which is, if I want to remove all loops from this and just end up with a tree that had no multiple paths to any node, how could I delete as little weight as possible and get down to that? And this might be the way to do it. OK. So we did that. We took all the, roughly 1,000 copies that we found on the internet. We did this for Iraq War. We did this for NPR. We did this for a few others. And we put something together. And we didn't really know what it would look like. But in the end, we got something that, this is it viewed from very, very far out. So ordinarily, this is actually 20,000 nodes. I'll get back to the question of how many people actually, we believe, saw the chain letter. But we got 20,000 in what we pulled off the internet. Normally, you can't meaningfully draw a graph, a network, on more than about 200 nodes. It just becomes this giant ball of spaghetti. But this is a very special network because it's a tree. It just starts somewhere. It just keeps branching down, down, down. And so you actually, it's a rare case where you can actually draw all 20,000 nodes. I have a 9-foot-high printout of it outside my office, actually, where you can actually see. If we zoom in, it's this interesting structure. And that's maybe zoomed in even a little far. Now, it looks kind of strange. So it's very stringy, but I warned you that would happen because everyone who posted lit up their path back to the root. And we didn't see all the other branching that we had missed out on. But it's also very deep. Now, in some sense, we knew it would be very deep because we saw these very long petitions. But it's very deep in a robust sense, right? There's consistent branching all the way down, suggesting that all these people really did touch the email at some point. So there are some mysteries here. Some of them are sort of, we could work out with models. Some of them, I would argue, are sort of still open questions now, right? So it's now been, there's me playing with my 9-foot-high printout of it, actually. Some of these actually are now really very robust, right? When we see a meme spread on Facebook or on Twitter and you build these trees, they have a very recurring structure that's this very, very deep, narrow structure. And we don't fully understand why that is. So sort of two things in need of explanation. One we can dispose of quickly. One is just the narrowness and the single child fraction, right? 90% of these nodes appear to have only one child. But again, that's really because when you post your copy, you light up a path back, and you sort of miss a lot of the branching along the way. That's something we can handle. The depth, though, is something that's still a mystery, right? So one of the fundamental principles of social network structure is this idea that we're all have very short paths between each other in the social network of the world, right? If you think back to that network neighborhood of you, your classmates, your coworkers, and so forth, right? That's sort of one step away in the network of the world. But if you think about everyone you can reach in 3 or 4 steps, right? So take a classmate who grew up in another country, think about their parent, think about an acquaintance of their parent. You're 3 steps away, right? You to your classmate, to your parent, to their friend. But you're in a very different part of the world, someone who has no languages in common with you, someone who you would have absolutely no idea if you were sitting next to them on a train somewhere in the world that you had anything in common with them. That's only 3 steps away, right? By 4 or 5 steps, and this has been demonstrated empirically many times, you're bringing in much of the world. So this chain letter would have had no problem if it took the most direct route, reaching almost everybody, and only getting about 5 or 6 levels deep. So you might have guessed that this thing should have looked like, it just kind of goes, and now it's just, if it's reached everyone it's going to reach. But that's not all what happened, right? I mean, it looked like this. So what's going on? How can there be such direct connections between all of us, and yet the thing took sometimes upwards of 100 steps to get to this person? Okay. So there are sort of a few ingredients here. But I guess they don't fully explain everything. So, right, so selective posting is certainly helping with the narrowness. For the extreme depth of the tree, some things that might help this along. Well, so first of all, people don't send it to all of their friends. They maybe send it to close friends. That means we're not reaching everyone you could possibly reach. We're just reaching some people. That does some of it. That certainly can't do all of it. The other one that seems to be happening is that nodes are reacting at very different speeds, right? So this would be true. It would take us only maybe 6 steps to get there if everyone reacted in lockstep. Today I send it out. Tomorrow my friends send it. The next day their friends send it. In a few short steps, maybe it reaches everyone. But that's not really what happens. I send it. One person sends it on in 5 minutes. One person takes an hour to do it. One person comes back to it 3 days later. And so the thing gets very unbalanced, right? Certain paths, certain routes to the tree get much longer than others. And so, in fact, this taps into a bunch of work that people have done over the past 4 decades of thinking about not how many steps away are things in networks, but how many steps away are things in networks if along each link there's a very, very different travel time, right? And that some things take 5 minutes to get passed along, some things take 3 days, some take a week. Okay? So that's sort of an interesting possible point of connection, but it really remains an open question to give really a robust model for how it is that so consistently, when someone releases a meme onto the internet, despite being in a world where everything is so close together, the tree goes on so deep, right? There are really very few examples, if you look across Facebook and Twitter and all of the modern platforms in which this is happening, where a meme really sort of extinguishes itself in a few short steps. And if it's that common a phenomenon, it feels like there should be a comparably simple explanation for what's going on. And while we have some complicated ones, I feel like sort of the simple one is still sort of missing. Okay, so this is sort of some things to keep in mind when we think about how the information spreads structurally, right? It spreads along these tree-like structures, people passing into each other. in principle, there are these very short ways to get from anyone to anyone, but in practice, it actually takes many more steps for reasons we don't fully understand. Okay. Let me talk about sort of two things that you then try to bring to bear on this problem. Once you say, it's interesting how this information is spreading. It's now really one of the basic transport mechanisms on the internet, right? Think how much it has changed such that rather than go out and search for information, you often find a lot of the interesting content that you pursue because it comes to you. It seeks you out through social media. It's in your newsfeed. It's on Twitter. It's on Instagram, and so forth. The information is coming and finding you, right? Essentially, right, this is your interface to the world. Here's you. And a lot of stuff is just kind of coming through this as the last hop. And so if it's coming through that as the last hop, there are two things we'd like to understand. One is, how is the actual content affecting what you decide to act on, what you decide to forward, what changes your opinion? And secondly, what is the actual structure of this thing such that this is where all this stuff is coming? All right, let's talk about message content. Because it'd be sort of funny to have started with these compelling chain letters with their compelling messages, and then to just treat them as these little dots that kind of traverse this network in this very abstract way, right? Let's go back to the actual messages, right? So they began with an appeal. And there was something, striking about these appeals, right? Maybe it was important for the success of this chain letter that they mentioned it would, after all, be only $1.12 of your taxes, right? Maybe had they left that out, the whole thing wouldn't have succeeded. And maybe it was important that this chain letter, sort of slightly played with the truth about did the US Congress really authorize the president? They decided to call it a UN petition for peace for reasons that didn't really have anything to do with the UN, but they put that in. Maybe that was instrumental, right? So there were a bunch of choices of how to phrase this. Did the phrasing of the appeal actually matter? Now, it's very hard to run the counterfactual here, right? In order to really ask, did this matter, I would have to imagine the universe where Elizabeth Weiner left out the $1.12 per year of taxes and see if she ran it. And even then, there'd be so much randomness in the process that maybe just that chain letter got unlucky. So, so compelling messages tend to be written under compelling circumstances. How do I separate the message from circumstances? Okay, so we were thinking about this issue as we began sort of going around compiling viral messages in many, many contexts. This is one that Yuri Leskovich and Lars Backstrom and I did in fall of 2008 in the run-up to the 2008 presidential election, basically taking the final 3 months up to the election, crawling all of the quoted phrases that occurred on the internet and just looking at frequency. And just looking at kind of, and for those of you who sort of can remember back that far, all of the kind of quotes that appeared in the news uttered by Barack Obama, by John McCain, by Sarah Palin, Joe Biden, and so forth. And just sort of looking at week by week, the Democratic convention and the Republican convention and a whole bunch of things, the financial crisis. And, many, many cases of viral text. And the question is, again, all of them uttered under compelling circumstances. How is that going to give us any leverage? Well, there was this interesting thing going on. And this was really what we noticed in some follow-up work that we did. And this was with Lillian Lee, Justin Cheng, and Christian Danescu, Nicolescu Miesel, that all of these things are parts of a much longer quote, right? So the quote that had the most volume from 2008, this phrase, lipstick on a pig, unwittingly uttered by Barack Obama, which thereby commandeered the news cycle for an entire week. It was part of a longer speech that he gave, of which the surrounding context, right, and this was just after the Republican convention, that you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. You can wrap an old fish in a piece of paper called change, but it's still going to stink. Okay, and it was, of course, a much longer speech than that. And you think to yourself, old fish and piece of paper, that's sort of a nice image, the old fish and piece of paper. That didn't go anywhere, right? It was this other part of it, and so now there's something interesting going on, right? That it's the same piece of text, but one part pops out. And is there something in the language that helps it pop out, right? There are lots of things that could cause it to pop out. Could we recognize it directly in the language, right? We're trying to zero in on this question. Is there something in message content that we could actually identify automatically, right, algorithmically? Could we give an algorithm many, many instances of these pieces of text and try to find this is the part that stands out. This is the part that becomes viral, right, by looking into the language content of it, right? Here, too, there's actually an implicit graph going on because to even reconstruct these quotes, we're pulling quotes from off the news. And there are many, many variants of them, right? So this is different fragments of Sarah Palin's quote about he's palling around with terrorists who would target their own country from October of that year. And the point is, each of them sort of, this one is a subfragment of this one, which is a subfragment of that one, and so forth. And there's essentially a graph showing not who knows whom, but which phrase is contained in which other phrase. And in that way, we can again try to reconstruct these sort of longer fragments. Okay, but the question is, we're sort of effectively controlling for context as the language varies. Could we actually go into the text and try to figure out what is making this thing work? One concrete way to do this is to say, if I gave an algorithm lots of this text and I kept telling it this part was what worked, this part was what worked, this part was what worked, could it begin to learn algorithmically to recognize the parts of it that were actually working? Okay, so the pre-election news cycle is nice for this, but sort of pulling together everything we had, maybe we had about 50 to 100 cases of something which really popped. We wanted, an order of magnitude or two more than that. So we asked ourselves, is there somewhere in the world where there's this laboratory where people are just ceaselessly trying their hardest to produce viral text, have it go viral, and then have it spread out? And the answer is there are a few, but one is certainly movies. Right? Movies consist of some of the most memorable text that exists in the world, some of the most viral text. There are even sort of TV specials and web pages and so forth devoted to famous quotes from movies. And so we thought to ourselves, okay, here we could actually take a whole bunch of text and try to figure out, can we algorithmically identify what in the message is making it go viral? So for that, what do we want? We want this way of controlling for context, right? It could be that people just like everything that this actor says, right? It could be that people like everything from this movie. We should control for all that, just as we controlled for the things in the political speech. So we should take lines from movies that occur adjacent to each other, uttered by the same character in the same scene, to control for as much as we can. And then we need to know, what does it mean to go viral? But that's not hard, because certain quotes have massive presence on the internet, and certain quotes don't. So let me just sort of give you an example of how this works. And this is what we did this paper in 2012. So first of all, it's not hard to find scripts from movies on the internet. We took about 1,000 full scripts, each with about 1,000 lines, so that's like a million lines of text. We looked at pairs, two lines spoken by the same character in the same scene of the same movie, where one was memorable and the other was not, as measured by how much they appeared on the internet, right? Two nearby lines, one has occurred a lot, one has occurred very little. And then we're going to ask, we could ask humans this also, right? We actually had this quiz on the internet, which 15,000 people took. Can you tell which is the one that became famous? For sort of movies that people hadn't seen as much. But we also then asked an algorithm, right? We said, can we train an algorithm on the features that it has to do this? So as an example of how this works, many of you may recognize this scene from Star Wars Episode 4. This is Obi-Wan in the land speeder. He's basically trying to get through customs, basically. And so he's, the stormtrooper wants to use identification. He says, you don't need to use identification. He says, these aren't the droids you're looking for. You can go about his business. Okay. If you actually watch the scene, it's this sort of arid kind of, he's just saying stuff. It's not, there's no sense that one of these lines is not the punchline. But one of these lines became much, much more famous than all the others, right? One of them is the one that ended up on greeting cards, mugs, T-shirts, posters from music groups, photo memes, cartoons, We do other things besides look for droids, but that's all anyone ever remembers. The little stormtrooper waving goodbye, bye daddy, I hope you find the droids you're looking for. It's all over the internet, right? Now, maybe there could have been a world where everyone walked around with T-shirts that said, you don't need to see his identification, or he can go about his business. But we're not in that world. We're in this world. And the question is, was there something in that language that you could identify? Right? It's sort of an open question, because it could still be that it's really about the circumstances. It was the exact moment, the intonation, things that the algorithm would not have access to. But it would be interesting if there was something in the language, because if there were, it would start to give us a clue about, how do we identify text that's going to be compelling, text that at least has a slight edge in its ability to go viral. Okay, so this effectively becomes a machine learning problem, right? By machine learning problem, in this case, what are the ingredients I'm looking for? I have a bunch of training examples. I say, here are 2 quotes. This is the memorable one. Here are 2 quotes. This is the memorable one, right? We train the algorithm on this data, and then we give it a whole bunch of things it hasn't seen, and we see, can it predict better than 50-50 guessing which one is the memorable quote? If it can do better than 50-50, it has to be doing something in the data, because each pair, if you were to just guess, you have a 50% chance. Okay, so that was the, now how are we going to encode this for the computer, right? So we could put words in. But it turns out to be useful to look at other features of the text. And so here are some of the features that we looked at. So one that was sort of extremely useful is to ask, how probable are the word choices in the text? Right? So we take the text, And we say, let's take millions and millions of words of Newswire. Right? So there's just AP Newswire, which is sort of, we'll take as kind of, the room temperature of text. Right? It's just sort of the baseline, sort of vanilla text. OK, and we'll use that to determine the probabilities of words. Now we're going to ask, how likely are the words in this particular quote relative to that baseline? And one thing that we found is that actually the memorable quotes were less probable in their word choices. Right? They used more unusual words like droids, and rather than more common words like business. Okay? And that wasn't just true of words, but also 2- and 3-word sequences. Right? So if you take like memorable lines like "You had me at hello," which Renee Zellweger tearfully says in Jerry Maguire, no word here is unusual, but the phrase "at hello," very, very unusual. And actually, if you look at big text corpora, that 2-word pair, "at hello," occurred almost not at all until about 1998 when the movie was released, and then it began to climb after that. Now, this may or may not be intuitive, but what's interesting, and what sort of, I think, makes it clear that intuition is sort of only a poor guide to this, is that the opposite happens with part of speech composition. So I could also take these quotes, and I could boil them down to parts of speech, right? So you had me at hello. Pronoun, verb, pronoun, preposition, noun. I could just look at, that 5-part speech sequence. And for example, you had me at hello has the same part speech sequence as the highly unmemorable I met him in Boston. Okay? So in fact, what we found was that memorable quotes were more probable in their part of speech composition, right? If you compare them to Newswire text, and you blur your eyes, you don't see the words, you just see the parts of speech, memorable quotes are actually more like Newswire than the non-memorable ones. And so from this, we got sort of a useful principle that we could try using, which is a memorable quote, in aggregate, to some approximation, is sort of like a sequence of unusual words built on a scaffolding of common part of speech patterns, right? The simple syntax means it goes down very smoothly, but the unusual words kind of make it stand out. OK, so from this, we actually could just use as features the probabilities of the words involved. Right? That becomes a numerical set of features. It was actually much more useful, much more powerful than using just the raw words. And it could do much, much better than chance prediction. Now, what's interesting is it still doesn't match human beings. Right? So we did this test on the internet, 15,000 people. And these were sort of, yeah, they were memorable. But if you hadn't, these are from, movies that not a lot of people had necessarily seen. The internet said this was the more memorable one. But it seemed like a reasonable test for most people not having seen them. But people were 75% accurate distinguishing this, which was better than our algorithm at 64%, which was still way above chance prediction, which is only 50%. Right? So it says that the language is getting us partway there algorithmically, and it leaves several possibilities open. One is better algorithms, right, using more than just, say, parts of speech, word probabilities, might actually do even better. It could also be that there is context that people are recognizing that we're not seeing here. OK, so that's content. And one thing that's interesting, I think, to go back to this graph that we had, which is not who knows whom, it's not even on people, it's on phrases, right, on how the phrases are included, is that we can combine this memorability with this kind of mutation analysis. Right, this is sort of what we had to do in assembling the news sources. This was done even more extensively by Simmons, Adamic, and Adar 2 years later. Right, the fact that these things mutate as they travel. And they, the question is, do they mutate into sort of from less memorable to more memorable forms? So what's interesting here is that if we go back to the word meme, right, a word that we all say about things on the internet, right, that word actually comes from Richard Dawkins in the 1970s, who was really making a very concrete analogy that bits of text and other bits of cultural practice are like genetic elements. Right? They travel around, they mutate, they evolve, they want to survive, they want to reproduce in some statistical sense. And that was always a kind of metaphor, a kind of pedagogical metaphor. But you sort of feel like with the data we have in these kinds of computational models, you can begin to make it for the first time concrete. Because if you really want to explore this genetic analogy to textual memes, what would you want? You'd want a fitness function. Right? And memorability is a kind of fitness function that we're trying to infer from many, many training examples. You would want a mutation mechanism. Right? And this really was sort of what, especially what Simmons, Adamic, and Adar were looking for. And they really found certain things that were analogous to DNA, right? That there's the junk DNA part that mutates rapidly, and there's the functional part that mutates slowly, right? Somehow the payload of this, right, palling around with terrorists, that part never really changed. Right? The other parts could mutate very rapidly. The choice of sort of preamble wording, the, did you say, he or him or whatever. And so the mutation mechanism seems to have some recurring pattern. And then you want a population structure like the social network on which it's spreading. So I think there are a lot of interesting open questions here as we really try deepening these computational models to think about what is making these things work. OK, which brings me to the last ingredient of this, the population structure, right? The actual interface you have to the rest of the network. Now, the interesting thing going on here, again, if we think about sort of your close friends, your distant friends, the strong and weak ties, right? To try understanding how this is operating in social media, right? So what's happening here really, right, again, your strong ties, which promote trusted interactions, right? People you know very well, you have very strong feelings for. Weak ties, people you know less well, less trusted interaction. On the other hand, huge source of new information. One thing that you can think of social media like Facebook is doing, really, when you ask what is it, what is it doing? One change I would argue that's actually quite massive, but very subtle, that's brought about in society, is that if I think about my experience, say going away to college at the age of 18, there was a day of my high school graduation. I was in a room with 200 people. We all graduated, and on that day, right, that exact day, I essentially permanently lost touch with maybe 160 of those people, right? I have not heard from them again. And that's sort of sad in a way, right? That's just a fact of, the generation and the lifestyle I grew up in. You went off to college, you went off and you got a job somewhere, and you kept in touch with a bunch of them, but a bunch of them you never heard from again. And somehow that has changed to some extent, right? It's not that people now are necessarily in close contact with every single person, but there's this kind of ambient awareness that I didn't have thanks to things like social media, right? You can think of Facebook as this thing that says, you go away to college, but all those friends you had on Facebook from high school have the property that, if something big happens, right, they get married, they have a baby, something like that, you'll hear about it, right? It'll be way off in your peripheral vision, but it'll come to you in your Facebook newsfeed. You'll find out about it. And so you're simply ambiently aware of many, many more people and the goings on in their lives than, for example, people in my generation were, right? And so it's Facebook as a maintainer of weak ties, right? These very, very weak ties, people where you really no longer know them very well at all, but every 2-3 years you hear about them, right? Every 5 years. You could argue that that's something that human beings unassisted cannot do, right? It is cognitively too difficult for us to maintain ties that are that weak but not zero, right? A tie that weak just drops to zero. You cognitively can't handle that. But Facebook can do that forever, right? Facebook can maintain that tie for as long as you want, and it can keep sort of occasionally sending you information. And that's really, I think, one very subtle change, one change in the background that's happening in the way we experience social connections now compared to all that time ago. And for people like me, there's also this notion of the past kind of welling out of the background. The people I had lost touch with, somehow now through Facebook, I'm suddenly aware of, again, just very distantly in my peripheral vision. Now, if that's all going to work, it follows that the algorithms Facebook is using to prioritize your feed have to be very sensitive to that. Because after all of these people are producing a lot of content every day, potentially. And yet what you're seeing is some kind of layered thing where there are certain people that you do want to see what they had for dinner last night and the photo of the dessert on the plate and so forth. And then there are other people where, every 2-3 years, let me know if, you change jobs or, you get married or something like that, right? And so there's this layering by tie strength, right? The very strongest ties you want to treat differently than the other ties. And so Lars Backstrom, who's the engineering director of Newsfeed at Facebook, he and I have been working closely on some of these questions for the last few years. And there's just these very interesting algorithmic questions about how do you maintain that kind of a social structure. And I should say it's really him working with his group of 60 people on this, and I occasionally sort of show up to find some interesting question that we can work on together. Here's one of the interesting questions that we thought about, which is how do we use the pure network structure to prioritize this kind of content, right? So suppose I gave you a snapshot of someone's network neighborhood. How would you find their strongest ties, right? The ones where you really want to see what they had for dinner last night, the ones where you want to see something every day, versus the very weak ties, okay? This is going to be sort of the last question that I sort of think about here. How would we design an algorithm that would try to sort of create this layering that's sort of so crucial to how Lars and his team actually prioritize the Facebook newsfeed? So if we go into the sociology literature, the sort of theory of strong and weak ties, which again really originated in this kind of monumental paper by Mark Granovetter in 1973. The sort of gold standard for doing this is what they call the embeddedness, right? So here's a little graph consisting of, V and W are two people. This is their friendship. They have these 4 friends in common. And we'll say the embeddedness of this VW link is just the number of mutual friends that they have in common with each other. Okay, so the embeddedness of this link is 4. All right, so if that's, now the argument in the theory of strong and weak ties is that close friends have high embeddedness, right? If you know someone really well, over time you're just going to accumulate a lot of mutual friends. You're going to do things together, you're going to meet people together, you're going to be in similar social circles. Whereas someone who's a very distant acquaintance, you might have even an embeddedness of 0. You might know no one in common. You met them once on a trip, you became friends on Facebook, you kind of correspond, but you would not be able to name a single mutual friend that you have. Okay, so that's the gold standard. Maybe we should just rank the neighbors of a person by embeddedness, right? If I'm trying to find an algorithm to find the strongest ties, I just sort everyone by their embeddedness and take the top and say, these are your closest friends. Okay? So we could try that. Let's go back to this Facebook engineer and all of his friends. And ranking by embeddedness is one of these things that sounds great, and then the instant you try it, you sort of realize what you should have known all along, that it's not going to work. Which is, it's okay, but the problem is that this is the coworker cluster. The coworker cluster, in his case, and in Maple's case, is huge. He's just friends with all these people. And so for any random person he works with, there are like 30, 40 mutual friends. And yet if you asked him, is this your closest friend in the world? He said, no, I know that person, and we know a lot of people in common. But the problem is, like the family cluster, it's just too small. It just can't compete, right? There are like 10 of them. So how is it going to compete with the coworker cluster? So there's a kind of currency conversion problem, right? Somehow mutual friends here are just worth different amounts of mutual friends there. All right. So as we looked at it, we began. I mentioned, right? It's an aesthetically compelling thing. Lars and I would go back and we'd stare at it, as we were doing all this. And every time you stare at it, you see things you didn't see before. And here we saw something, and maybe you guys saw it right away. This node kind of jumps out. This node's interesting, right? What's going on with that? So this node down here at about 7 o'clock has links kind of radiating out all over the network. They also have pretty good embeddedness. It's not quite this high, but definitely much more interesting. Now, I should mention, how did I draw this picture? Or I didn't draw it. How did they draw this picture? It's a spring embedding. We put all the nodes down. We require that they have a center of gravity that's here. But subject to having a center of gravity that's here, they want, imagine there's a spring on each edge. The springs want to shrink as much as possible. So when there's a big mass of springs, these nodes all get pulled together. When there are fewer things, they can get spread out. This node sort of has nowhere to go. All of its springs are being pulled all over the place because it's somehow unclassifiable. Right? This person's actually his spouse. Yeah, that's his wife. What? That's interesting. It's his wife. Oh. So that's somehow, it jumped out of the picture. So if it's jumping out in the picture, we should be able to somehow find it automatically. Right? We didn't do much. We drew the picture and we saw it. So we have a situation that's sort of common when you're thinking about algorithms and how to extend them. Right? So we had this problem that, the embeddedness of the coworkers, but the node in the lower left is somehow this interesting person. Right? A situation that's common when you're trying to design algorithms, you find these sort of challenge cases that your techniques can't handle. What was the challenge case here? That there was this interesting kind of tie that was flying under the radar of the techniques we had. Right? The technique we had is embeddedness, or variations on embeddedness. And it just wasn't doing it. It was not finding this person. And so we set ourselves a challenge. And it wasn't the challenge we set out to solve, but it was sort of the one that forced us to kind of stretch our techniques here. And the challenge is, given this as input to the algorithm, right? Given this network, only the connections, can you find the relationship partner just from the network structure? Okay, that's the question. Now, it's true, obviously we can hold back the secret answer, but what we're trying to ask is, can we find an algorithm that can do this? Because embeddedness is not doing the job for us. Okay, all right. So that was the question. In a way, it was a kind of question I like answering. I like answering questions about algorithms on graphs. It was sort of an unusual one in that it's very concrete, right? There's a right answer. It's sort of only, it's sort of hard to formalize. Like, all we know is what the spouse is. Okay, but it's very easy to know when you've got the right answer. So in brief, here was the idea that we pursued, which was embeddedness is really something very simple. It says count the number of mutual friends. But why just count, right? What stood out to us about the spouse is that the mutual friends were organized in a very, very different kind of structure. They weren't like this. They were like this, right? This is the coworker signature. All 4 of your mutual friends all know each other because they all work at the same company with you. This is more the spouse, or for that matter, the sibling, the spouse of the sibling, or any of these people. You share things from different contexts in your life, right? So you have the 2 people you know from this context, but you also have that other friend, you also have the other friend, and they don't know each other. The 2 of you are the kind of both jointly the bridge between all these different things. Okay? So if they're not well connected, it really says something about this relationship between them. So maybe that's what we should look for, right? We should look for many mutual friends who are all badly connected to each other. So we could do this algorithmically. I'll just sort of splash up one slide that sort of spells this out. Right, here's V and W. If you're looking for sort of people who act as bridges, one way to find those in a network is to take out the center of the bridge, V and W, and ask, how long a detour do people have to follow to get to each other, right? That's sort of how you identify a sort of key bridge in the structure. Like, you have long detours if you remove it. So we take out V and W, and we say, there's high dispersion, right? We'll call this link disperses its mutual friends if, without these 2, to get between these people, there are very long ways around. Some of them just go directly still, right? Some of them are still friends with each other. But many pairs have to go a long way around. Okay? So we could say the dispersion of this link is simply the sum of all the distances in the network of all the pairs of mutual friends, how far they'd have to go if V and W weren't there. So now we have another idea. We could sort things by dispersion. So let me tell you about a test that we did on Facebook to see how this worked, and then I'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts. So the idea. We'd like to know embeddedness is one way to try to find the relationship partner. Now we have a competing idea, dispersion, which looks at the structure of the mutual friends and how much this link disperses them, separates them. So what we're going to do is compare these to each other. So it was nice that we could do this analysis by piggybacking it on the information that Facebook Newsfeed was already collecting when it loads a page, right? And that's what Lars and his team were building already. And so basically, we would take the information they had. We picked 1.3 million Facebook users chosen uniformly at random, subject to just a few conditions. One is that they declared a relationship partner in their profile. And various tests we did suggested that these were, by and large, the real relationship partners. They had between 50 and 2,000 friends to eliminate the extremes. They were at least 20 years old, which we did for all sorts of reasons. One was to bypass a kind of known failure mode of Facebook relationship partner field, which at the time, which was that teenage girls often describe themselves as married to their best friend. But by doing at least 20 years old, then you avoided most of that. So, okay. So for each user V, we're going to rank all of the friends by these competing metrics and see which one works the best to find the relationship partner. So the embeddedness, this gold standard from sociology. The dispersion, this thing that we made up by looking more closely at the structure. And then, of course, when Facebook does a page load and it collects this information about the graph, it also collects a lot of activity metrics on you, right? For any other friend that you have, it knows how much did you message them, how much did you check in events together, comment on their content, like their content, right? All these things, appear in photos together. If these are actually going to be better at finding the relationship partner, we might as well use them. So of all of those, the two that worked the best were the number of photos in which V and W were both tagged. Because if you show up together in a lot of photos, there's a chance that you're a close friend of this person. And also the number of times V viewed W's profile in the last 90 days. Because when two people are in a relationship, it just turns out empirically that they just do a lot of profile viewing. Okay, so for what fraction of all users V is the top ranked W the relationship partner? Now remember here, right? So you remember with the movie quotes, we had guessing was 50% because I showed you a memorable quote, non-memorable quote, you have to guess. But here guessing is much, much worse, right? Everyone here has at least 50 friends. And so if the algorithm were guessing, it would get at best a 2% correctness rate. So I was certainly, Lars and I were prepared to be happy if anything here was doing, say, 20%. That'd be like a factor of 10 better than straight guessing. And so the first thing that was a surprise was just how well this thing did. So I'll just walk you through a table here that shows some results. So for starters, I'll fill in the table gradually. If I look at all relationships, so this is married, engaged, and in a relationship, were the three fields three values we looked at. Embeddedness is not doing badly. It's doing about a quarter of the time it's correct, right? Again, with one guess, quarter of the time. But dispersion is doing more than twice as well, right? More than half the time, you give dispersion one guess, and it did what we did in that picture. It finds the relationship partner, right, with one guess. Right? It's actually a very, very strong signal. And it's doing better than the activity and behavioral metrics, the individual ones. Now, I should mention this is another sort of statement about the power of having the right algorithm, right? If we had started out and said, which is more useful, the network structure or these activity metrics? And all I knew about the network structure was that I should use embeddedness, the gold standard from sociology. I would have said, OK, 0.247 is less than these numbers, and so activity is better. And I would have been wrong, because I would have been using not the right algorithm, right? But with the right algorithm, it's actually doing better. All right, some other things to fill in. Structural metrics are even better for finding married couples, in principle, because the structure has somehow had more time to conform. In a relationship, actually, now the activity metrics start to become even more powerful. It's actually much easier to find the relationship partner for users of one gender than the other. Not obvious how this is going to go, right? Like, is it easier, right? So if the user in the middle is male, or if the user in the middle is female, in one case, the relationship partner stands out more. People sort of guess both ways on this, right? It turns out it's more easy to find the relationship partner for male users, right? So for male users, and actually for married men in the US, where it's even easier, you can get up to like 75% with dispersion, right? So it really stands out. For female users, it's a bit harder, but still reasonably good. OK. And then when the algorithm is right, so we can get even better if we just combine everything in a big machine learning engine. When it's wrong, it's often finding family members, right? Siblings, parents, adult children, and so forth. I can just run through like a couple other things. If you look over time, the structural measures sort of get better and better. Profile viewing actually falls off over time. So this is as the time since the relationship was reported, right? So the relationship kind of goes on in time. The structural metrics all kind of build around the relationship. The profile viewing goes down. Especially prominent in relationships where it's like overwhelming in the beginning how good it is at finding the relationship partner. And about 12 months, it sort of crosses with the structural metrics actually. So, a bunch of things. People kept asking us this question, so we finally went and computed it. It's true that when the algorithm is wrong, when it guesses the wrong person in first place, there's actually a 50% higher chance that the couple actually breaks up in the next 2 months than when. Now, again, breakups are only so frequent, right? So we're talking about like a 4%, 6% thing. So it's an added service, right? But it says there's something sort of unusual about the network structure that's not working in its favor. Okay, and finally, I feel like, remember that we didn't really set out to learn about relationship partners. It turned out to be this very, very interesting question in itself. And I feel like as we pull back, it actually taught us something additional about the network structure itself, right? If you had asked us sort of how do we picture these node neighborhoods, in cartoon form, remember they sort of looked like this. You had these different lobes going around, right? There's the coworkers and the classmates, the family, and so forth, right? This kind of node at the center and then these lobes, they're relatively disconnected. And I think thanks to all of this, we now understand there's really a richer structure going on, that it is these things. But at the very least, it's also sort of a constant number of nodes that sort of defy classification, right? These nodes that reach into different clusters, right? The spouse, the relationship partner, the sibling, and so forth, right? Nodes that sort of can't be classified. Interestingly, of course, the relationship partner and the sibling have this very similar structure and for entirely different reasons, right? The sibling grew up with you and met all these people in your life at the same time you did, right? They met your friends from high school when you were in high school, and they maybe met your friends from college when you were in college. The relationship partner is maybe more like a time traveler in your social circles, right? They've been reintroduced to all these things from your past, and the structural effect, of course, that we see is relatively similar. Okay, so we've seen a bunch of, right? So we've seen that this is a structure that now modulates the flow of information. As we think about social media and the algorithms that supports it, these are the kinds of computations, these kinds of deep analyses of the graphs that are really crucial to prioritizing the content that you see, right? It's really partly about the content that comes in, partly about the structure, partly about the people that it's coming from. And so, with that blend of things, right, all this data that we have on the structure, all this data that we have on the content, I wanted to wrap up with just one final slide of closing reflections. I'll actually start with this reflection, which is now 10 years old, from the summer of 2006, that 04 to 06 window when social media really began to grow rapidly. It's sort of a slightly grisly quote. This was when MySpace was big. But MySpace is doubly awkward because it makes public what should be private. It doesn't just create social networks, it analyzes them, spreads them out like a digestive tract on the autopsy table. You can see what's connected to what, who's connected to whom, sort of evoking an image from an earlier era, maybe 300 years ago, when people began to take scalpels to cadavers and sort of, learn what was going on. And other people turned away repulsed, saying, don't do that, I don't want to know what's inside a human body. And we're sort of doing that. Social networks are something that have been with us for as long as we have lived in social groups. They are very, very old social structures. And yet, the ability to look at them in this level of detail, to really sort of make guesses about them, make conjectures about them, and then try to validate them with data and algorithms, that's a very new thing, right? That's something that's happened in the last 10 to 20 years, and has really, been a revolution in measurement that's made a lot of things possible. And I think, what I think is sort of situates, computing and the mathematical aspects of computing very well is that it really has a lot of the tools for asking this next set of questions that we're all going to have to think about. So this question about really what is the right framework, right? The right mathematical and computational framework for addressing the questions that we see, very, very important. Something I didn't touch on in this talk, but it's sort of, hard to give a talk like this without at least invoking this issue, right? This is all based on massive amounts of personal data that are being, collected and assembled by, by these organizations that are then using it to serve you content. We should certainly think about, what are the dangers in stockpiling this much personal data. And that too is something where ideas from computation, ideas from algorithms have been very, very important. But I think in all of this, there's really this opportunity for these kinds of fundamental models to really inform how we think about these very, very important questions going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. We have time for some questions. We have a couple of volunteers circulating with microphones. I have a question.
Well, I was thinking, particularly in regards with that, the first examples you mentioned about the NPR email and the Rock War, and I remember getting those. Okay, I got them multiple times.
Yeah.
Okay, I only sent it on once.
Yeah.
So I was thinking you might not see a lot of the connections that are there just because nobody acted on them. In fact, I got pretty damn sick of seeing those.
Yeah. No, exactly. So I think the fact that when this thing reached peak intensity, this point you're making, that people would get many, many copies of them. And I think that, in fact, is what was sort of elongating the tree. That essentially, sort of, the one that you chose to forward is probably not the one that came to you by the most direct path, but it's one that had circulated through a bunch of your close friends. So if we think about, I think actually pictures like, the one we have here, this sort of suggests, think about that chain letter. How much did it rattle around in this cluster or that cluster before it got to you? And as it rattled around, it sort of unspooled this much longer path than would have been the most direct path. And so I think that actually is sort of a big component of it. It also sort of makes this point that the number of exposures you get to a piece of information is actually a fascinating question also, which we've looked at a lot. It wasn't in this particular talk, but what is your chance of forwarding the message if you get it once versus twice versus 3 times? Would it matter if the 2 times you got it both came through the same cluster or came once through here and once through there? It turns out that also matters. All of these are interesting questions. And at what point do you actually decide you've seen it so much you're not going to forward it, right?
Well, also the time scale comes into it because the people who send it first are the ones that
Exactly. So the ones who act faster, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's a very good point.
I was wondering if there is some algorithmic ways, if you want to implant into a given social structure, exploiting that. Is there some new ways of engineering this chain letter in that sense you can get wider spread if you knew the network structure and you know how some way to implant.
Yeah, interesting question, right. So are there sort of ways to sort of strategically inject things? So that's also a question that there's been a fair amount of research on, as in if I want to seed some sort of contagion, how should I do it? I would say that's one where the theoretical models sort of have gotten actually quite rich, and it's still sort of an open question which are going to be the most useful ones in practice. There has definitely been this insight that I think often the strategies that are used to seed things tend to be sort of too clustered in the initial adopter set, right? So when things like, let me target the most well-connected, influential people in the network, the challenge there is they all tend to know each other. And so you're ending up sort of redundantly hitting the same point in the network, whereas spreading things out, right? So asking, there are these sort of different non-interacting clusters in the network. I need to seed it sufficiently in each one, but I need to make sure I have good coverage of this. Turns out to be also a valuable thing. But we've seen a lot of these things that, it's also the case that cascades recur, right? So the NPR chain letter is almost like this kind of long-running infection in the system that kind of seems to have gone away. And then it's dormant. And then, budget cuts to NPR appear in the news and suddenly it just wakes itself up and then it starts spreading again. And so we also see that these cascades can recur. They can spread, then they're sort of there, and then they start spreading again. And finally, yeah, I think, hopefully we're beginning to learn things about what is the kind of message content that actually, has an effect. So I think in all of these respects, in the placement of the network, there's some insight about this, in the timing and sequencing of it, and then also in the content. Yeah.
It occurs to me that the relationship partner role is unique with respect to the rest of these. And more typical is relationship with one of these clusters of a faceted variety. So when you worry about information flow over these graphs, I may have a set of friends that I know through motorcycles or through computer science, and the information I get from computer scientists, I probably will take differently about motorcycles and vice versa. So your structural analysis and the content flowing over it, do you want to try and say something about how
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, that the content is going to conform to the structure. Right, so these different clusters, I'm going to sort of rely on them for different pieces of, different kinds of information. That's absolutely true. I should say that the relationship partner role, what's interesting is it's not entirely unique in the sense that sort of at a service level, family members often have this property also. And in some sense, friends that you've sort of known for a very, very long time start to accumulate the structure. Because in the end, the structure is really just about having shared connections in multiple contexts, right? And that's really what's triggering. So there tend to be some small number of people in one's life who have that property. But I agree, most information is coming through one of these dense clusters, and I'm going to use sort of different clusters. I'm going to draw on them for different information. And so, what's coming through the computer science cluster might be, I might care more about the computer science information coming and less about what they think about sports, and I have my sports friends for that. Having said that, I think, there's this interesting relation between these issues and, this ongoing worry that social media is potentially contributing to increasing polarization. And the polarization argument there is that it has made it easier and easier to only listen to people that you already agree with, right? And so, if you think about sort of personalized blog readers where I can sort of target exactly the information that I want to get, it's sort of designed exactly not to challenge my points of view. What's interesting is that, there's an argument that online social networks may partly be, at least an attempt at an antidote to some of that, right? Because if I can completely select the information that I'm reading, right? I go and find exactly the blogs or, exactly the sort of celebrity Twitter feeds that I want to see, then I can sort of tailor the information, and I live in this cocoon where I only see things that don't challenge my worldview. On the other hand, people tend to be less good at or less brutal about selecting their friends, because you have friends for all sorts of reasons. You have friends because you grew up with them. You have friends because you play racquetball with them. And for, all these people, they may not agree with you on very many things, but there's this notion that some people, you just like them. It's just, you've known them for a long time. And as a result, the things that they share, you end up getting exposed to potentially a wider array of things through those ties, through those social ties, than you would have if you had gone seeking out exactly the information that you wanted. So I think there's an interesting tension there, that information can be very tailored, coming through these different clusters, but it also is more diverse than one might got if one had sort of sought it out. And so, I think actually trying to explore that tension and some of the implications for things like political polarization is actually very, very interesting.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this fascinating talk. In particular, I was very interested in the part of looking for the words in a whole speech that will really stand out and go viral. And in particular, you really glimpse over, but do you have an idea of how to incorporate the environment in which those words will go viral? For example, if you talk about terrorists and just an attack happened, this part will likely stand out more than if no attack was, or the sentence of the drones maybe was latent and not having a lot of relevance, and then suddenly something happened with the drones in the Middle East, and then this part of the speech stands out.
Yeah.
So do you have any idea of how to integrate this in the analysis and not just about the grammatical structure and the verbal of the
it's
words?
a very interesting question, how to incorporate context. In some sense, right, we had sort of set up the first layer of question as, if we sort of try to subtract context as much as possible, are there things in the language that still matter? Because it was entirely possible that it's only context. How things resonate with context, this is something that we've actually been trying to look at, where you ask the question, how much does what's being uttered here, conform to the sort of average model, not of, say, vanilla text like Newswire, but of, say, the local text in the vicinity of that, right? Sort of what's been going on in that window or around there. And there's certainly, so with so I would say that, there's sort of a working conjecture that, right, things that sort of more conform to the local language model but are distinctive from the overall language model may be the ones that sort of stand out because they're conforming to something that's sort of transient, that's happening right now, but is sort of distinctive on a much longer time scale. But yeah, it's remains sort of an open question there. We talked at the time with a lot of political reporters during that particular election, 2008. And a lot of what they talked about was sort of the power of context in these things, right? That often these political campaigns think in terms of the condition is right for a certain kind of perfect storm to develop, but if it does, so late in the 2008 campaign, and sorry to be invoking ancient history when obviously there were sort of compelling things happening right now also, but this was the era in which we sort of were looking at this. So 2008 campaign, as one reporter described it, the McCain campaign was very worried that at some campaign stop, John McCain would sort of walk up stage, trip on a microphone cord and fall over, and that'd be captured on video. Because the concern was that John McCain was sort of, older, and what if he was sort of not, infirm and so forth. Whereas Barack Obama tripping on a microphone cord would have not gone viral because, so he tripped on a microphone cord, so what, right? And so there was a notion that the circumstances were right for, all you do is drop the right story into the sort of weather vortex, and the thing would just take care of itself, right? Lipstick on a Pig, they argued, had some of that, right? So the week before, Sarah Palin had been introduced to the world at the Republican convention and had described herself as a pit bull with lipstick, right? And so somehow Lipstick on a Pig unwittingly was sort of an echo of that, and seemingly a kind of mocking echo of it. And the argument was that was sort of what accidentally caused that to tip and go viral. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of interesting sort of at this anecdotal level of things where like the conditions are right, something happened. And we're, definitely very interested in, there ought to be a way to sort of algorithmically find this by looking at just, here's the local model of what's happening that week in the language. Here's what was happening overall. Here's how it sort of fits the local model and deviates from the global model. Yeah.
We'll take one or two more questions.
Yeah, the research that you're doing seems to be on snapshots or static data of the social network. And it would seem that, especially with today's computing power, you could start mining temporal data.
Yeah.
And that, for instance, in the spousal relationship, if you started looking at branches being formed simultaneously or within a certain time span, you would actually hone in on what you get statically.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent point. That these networks are evolving. They're evolving over time continuously. And in fact, one thing that we did look at in the work on relationship partner detection, which I didn't talk about, was as the relationship forms, how does the network conform around it, right? So when the relationship starts. And so one other indication of sort of the power of some of these methods of detecting it is, so for example, dispersion can actually detect the new relationship sort of, up to roughly 90 days earlier than some of the less powerful methods because the network is starting to develop around the relationship, and it sort of fills certain things first before embeddedness, for example, catches it. But yeah, it's very natural to think about the evolution. And of course, the spread of opinions co-evolves with the spread of the network structure. And so one thing that's also theoretically very interesting is to think about, I tend to be influenced by the people whose, blogs I read, for example, whose blog writing I read or whose social media I read. And in turn, I therefore seek out connections with people who are like them, which causes me to get even more influenced. And this gets back to the polarization argument that polarization, there's a worry, it arises from that spiral that, the more I get influenced by certain views, the more I seek out other people who are going to express those views, and the network begins to sort of tear apart, right? And the question really is, can we, if we look at sort of these temporal snapshots, can we sort of think about ways to sort of, if we thought that was, important to sort of counteract some of those influences?
Did you think about the role of when people die? I mean, if you take them off, then the network collapses. But you shouldn't take them off because they still have an influence.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it.
What does it mean in the system to die slowly? I mean, to fade out.
No, I think that there are a lot of interesting questions. And obviously when so actually there has been some work on looking at people who've died in say even in the social media context. There's also work just in sociology on the social networks, as people age. My colleague Ben Cornwell at Cornell has done some of the most interesting work on this. And there are obviously highly disruptive events. So for example, one thing people study in the sociology of aging is the effect of spousal death, which can be, obviously terrible and disruptive for many reasons, including that it can often sort of disconnect you from a part of the social network that you had access to through your spouse. It may also connect you. You may also end up bridging connections that were otherwise lost, right? All of those things happen. And so, I think all of these, in some sense we think of networks, it's sort of too easy to think of them as kind of these processes of accretion. Everything grows. Nodes arrive, links form. But all of these things work in both directions, and how the network conforms around disruption, I think is also a very, very interesting question that people are only starting to look at.
We can take a couple more back there.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk about sort of how the veracity of information affects how it propagates through the network, in particular the sort of truthful information have a different structure.
Yeah, right. So all of the sort of, things that are false on the internet, right. Including the fact that it's not obvious that funding to NPR actually was threatened when she wrote that letter, nor is it really correct that Congress had authorized the, right. So all of these are, so there's this kind of anecdotal sense that, false things spread more rapidly on the internet than true things, right? So, the falsehoods just kind of zip around social media. And it's not clear there's a lot of evidence that that's necessarily, that may or may not be true. But I don't think we really know enough to, and actually, Lada Adamek, whose name came up in the context of meme mutation, has done some of the most interesting work. And so if you look at her work, she tries to really get into the question of sort of, you know, the truthful version of things versus the false version of things and looking at differences in spread. And even sort of often there's kind of a corrective wave that tries to overtake the false wave, right? So something will spread on Facebook that's just obviously false and almost sort of laughably false. And then people will begin trying to correct it. They'll say, no, that thing wasn't true, and then that will spread. And somehow, obviously one wave can't really catch up with another. But so it's something one can measure. And it's a complicated picture, which isn't necessarily simple. But yeah, I think this question of veracity is a very interesting one. It also is closely tied with mutation, right? Because often what happens is something correct set out into the network, and then it began to mutate, and as it mutated, it became incorrect. It's also, some of this falsehood can almost be structural, right? It's not that what's being said is false, it's that the impression one gets is false. One kind of compelling structural example of that is the Iraq War chain letter, right? So all of them had as their first signatory this woman named Suzanne Doth, who lived in Grenoble, France. And when this thing was spreading all over the world and everyone was getting many copies of it, the media tracked her down in Grenoble and said, you know, do you realize that you launched this thing that became the most widely circulated chain letter on the internet? And she said she didn't. What happened was she had signed a petition on the internet to argue for protecting the rights of the women of Afghanistan from the Taliban, which had been written about 3 years earlier. And she was, you know, signatory number, whatever, you know, 50 or 100 or something. Someone, who knows whom, and it's sort of lost to history, took one copy of that thing, snipped off all the earlier names, wrote the Iraq War preamble, put her name at the top, and sent it out, right? And that was how she ended up at the top of this whole thing. And so, you know, in a way, the falsehood there was just the kind of composition of elements in the message more than any one sentence in the message. So I think, yeah, it's important to be careful when one looks at this. You know, and of course, we have an obligation to be careful ourselves. When we look at this data, one has to be careful. You know, so a while back, I got this very well-reasoned email from this woman who said, you know, I enjoyed reading about your research in the news, but, you know, you should know that if you were to try mining my behavior, you know, my computer gets used, you know, not just by me, but by the other people at the senior citizen home. I often do research on their behalf for all sorts of medical ailments that they have. My teenage kids come and they look up hip-hop lyrics. If you were to actually look at my behavior, you'd conclude that, you know, I'm an elderly person who has every known medical ailment and likes hip-hop. And that would be completely wrong. And that's a totally fair point, right? That, you know, we're only seeing what's in the data. Now, as time has gone on, you know, these analyses have gotten more sophisticated about trying to sort of separate out multiple behaviors that are contained under the same username, for example. These are sort of known things. But there are a lot of things that we don't even know to watch for. And so I think, you know, all it says, the falsehood is layered at different levels, right? It's level of the content, it's in the structure, and then it's also often the inferences. You know, one always has to be careful about big data inferences that you read about. Were they spoofed by some artifact in the data in some direction? You know, and I think the things we've been doing, you know, we've gotten better and better at trying to bulletproof things against that. But these are all worries.
Well, we could go on and on, but let's thank John.
Thanks very much.